Welcome to Brainwaves and Breakthroughs.
Welcome to the deep dive. Ever feel like you can hear sounds just fine, but actually understanding conversation, maybe in a noisy cafe or something, it just feels like really hard work.
Yeah, it's like your ears are working, you maybe even passed a hearing test.
Right. They say your hearing's normal.
Exactly. But listening still feels exhausting, you miss things. That frustration, that's really at the core of what we're digging into today. Auditory Processing Disorder, or APD, and we're focusing particularly on how it affects adults.
Okay, so APD in adults.
It's actually surprisingly common, I think, but people don't always know what it is. They just know they struggle. And it's not about the ears detecting sound, like you said. It's about what happens after the sound gets to your brain.
That processing part.
That's it. That's the Central Auditory Processing Disorder, or CAPD, aspect we've been looking at in our sources.
And we've got, well, quite a bit to unpack here. We're looking at info from places like ASHA, the American Speech Language Hearing Association.
And a really recent systematic review, actually, from Frontiers in Human Neuroscience. That one zeroed right in on interventions for adults with APD.
And another detailed piece too, right? Looking at diagnosis and specific strategies.
Yeah, from Bellis and Anzalone. It really highlights how different types of APD might need different kinds of help.
Okay, so the goal for us today is really to give you, the listener, a clear, hopefully quick, but definitely well-informed picture. What is APD in adults? How do professionals figure it out? And maybe most importantly, what does the current research actually say helps? Let's try and get you a good handle on it.
All right, let's do it.
Yeah.
So, right from the start, what exactly is auditory processing disorder? I see APD, CAPD. Are they the same thing?
Yeah, pretty much interchangeable terms. Think of it like this. Your ears are like microphones, right? They pick up the sound waves.
But understanding speech, figuring out where a noise came from, tuning into one voice in a crowd, all that complex stuff happens after the microphone stage. It happens in your brainstem and the auditory parts of your brain. Audiologists call this whole pathway the Central Auditory Nervous System, or CAN.
CNS.
Got it. So APD is basically a problem, a neural dysfunction within that CANS. The brain struggles to accurately, efficiently interpret the sound signals the ears are sending up.
So this is really important then. Someone could sit in that quiet booth, hear all the little beeps on a standard hearing test perfectly.
Absolutely, and still have APD.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, because that standard test, the pure tone audiogram, it mainly measures how sensitive your ears are to very quiet sounds, your hearing thresholds. People with APD often have completely normal thresholds.
But their struggle is more in the real world.
Exactly. It's functional hearing, especially when things get noisy or complex. So, yes, struggling to follow conversations in noise, maybe mixing up words that sound similar like cat and cap, finding it hard to follow multi-step instructions, or even just locating where a sound is coming from. Some adults also mention things like music just doesn't sound right, or learning new jargon, like at work, or a new language feels incredibly difficult.
And the sources, like that Frontiers review, they actually break down different ways adults might end up with APD.
They do. They look at it kind of by onset. So there's developmental APD that's likely been there since childhood, maybe just wasn't picked up or diagnosed back then.
Okay.
Then there's acquired APD. This is linked to something that happens later in life. Could be just the natural aging process, or maybe a stroke, a traumatic brain injury, TBI. Conditions like multiple sclerosis, even dementia.
So it can develop later on.
Yes. And then there's secondary APD, which is linked to hearing loss in the ears themselves, the peripheral system, even if that hearing loss was temporary, like glue ear in childhood, or if it's a mild permanent loss.
Now, that link to aging and neurological conditions, that seems really key for adults. It might even start in middle age. And I wonder how that interacts if someone also has a bit of typical age-related hearing loss.
That's a great point. The sources definitely emphasize this connection in adults. And you're right, those central processing changes that can happen with age or health conditions, they can really amplify the impact of even a slight hearing loss in the ears.
So it's like a double whammy.
Kind of, yeah. The microphone, the ear, isn't picking up sound quite as perfectly, and the central processor, the brain, isn't working as efficiently either. Put those together, and listening in challenging situations becomes incredibly hard.
And that can have real consequences.
Absolutely. Social isolation, feeling anxious or depressed, problems at work, it can really impact quality of life.
And the numbers. How many people are we talking about? The estimates seem all over the place.
They really are, which tells you it's complex to measure. You see UK estimates from less than 1% of adults having it up to like over 75% in older groups, say over 55.
Wow, that's a huge range.
It is. The higher numbers probably capture even very subtle difficulties. But even at the lower end, it suggests a lot of adults could be struggling and might benefit from, effective ways to manage it.
Okay, so if these listening problems are common and they can overlap with other things, and just having the symptoms isn't enough, how do you find out if it's actually APD? What's that diagnostic journey look like?
It's definitely complex. That's a recurring theme in the sources. It's not one test and done. It really requires a multidisciplinary team effort, usually led by an audiologist who specializes in this.
So what's involved in that full assessment?
Well, first, a really detailed history, talking all about your specific listening difficulties, when they started, where you noticed them most. Then you absolutely need standard hearing tests, the pure tone test, speech testing in quiet.
The usual stuff.
The usual stuff, partly to see if there's any peripheral hearing loss. But crucially, they also test speech understanding in noise, because that's often where APD really shows up. They'll also do things like check your middle ear function. That's called admittance testing. Just make sure the eardrum and little bones are moving okay.
Okay, so rule out the basic ear stuff first.
Right. But then comes the specialized part, auditory processing behavioral tests. These are designed specifically to challenge the CAN-S, to see how your brain handles complex sound information. Things like listening to different sounds in each ear at the same time, or detecting tiny gaps in sounds, or understanding speech that's been sped up or filtered.
Sounds intense.
It can be. And they might also use physiological tests. Otoacoustic emissions, or OAEs. These measure faint sounds your inner ear actually produces itself, tells us the cochlea is healthy.
Okay.
And maybe an auditory brainstem response, or ABR. That measures the electrical signals traveling up the auditory nerve pathway towards the brain, basically checking the wiring is intact at that early stage.
And you mentioned, and the sources stress this, symptoms alone don't cut it for diagnosis.
I cannot stress that enough. Your symptoms are vital, they bring you in. But the formal diagnosis requires demonstrating that dysfunction in the central auditory system using these specific validated tests. Because, like you hinted, similar listening difficulties could stem from attention issues, language processing problems, cognitive factors, things that aren't APD itself.
Is there like a global gold standard for interpreting these test results? A single cutoff score?
Not really, no. There isn't one universally agreed upon set of criteria worldwide. Often, guidelines suggest looking for performance that's significantly below average, say, 2 standard deviations below the mean for your age, on at least 2 different validated AP tests, tapping into different processes.
Okay.
Yeah, plus usually needing near normal peripheral hearing thresholds and reasonable nonverbal cognitive abilities, again, to help rule out other primary causes. But these specific cutoffs aren't used everywhere.
And the roles. Who does what? You mentioned the audiologist leads.
Yes, both ASHA and Belson's alone are clear, diagnosing the CAN-S dysfunction using these specialized tests. That falls to the audiologist. Speech-language pathologists play a really important role too, though. They often collaborate on assessing the real-world impact of the difficulties and are heavily involved in planning and providing intervention.
What about other assessments, like language or thinking skills tests?
Super useful. They help understand the whole picture, a person's strengths, weaknesses, how the APD might be interacting with other things, but they aren't the tests that diagnose the APD itself. And screening tools like questionnaires, they can identify people at risk, but they don't diagnose.
It really sounds like you need that whole range of tests, that battery you mentioned, to get a clear picture.
Exactly. To get an accurate diagnosis, and importantly, a deficit-specific diagnosis, understanding what kind of processing is breaking down and maybe where you need that comprehensive approach, testing different skills and pathways in the CAN-S.
Okay, so let's say someone goes through all that, gets a diagnosis. What next? What can actually be done to help? What do the sources say about interventions?
Broadly, they talk about 3 main pillars, 3 categories of intervention.
Okay, what are they?
1, changing or modifying the listening environment itself. 2, specific exercises called auditory training. And 3, learning compensatory strategies.
And a key point from Bellis and Anzalone seems to be that it's not one size fits all, right? It depends on the specific diagnosis.
Absolutely critical. They really emphasize that the management plan has to be deficit specific. The tests ideally tell you what type of processing problem someone has, and the intervention is then tailored to tackle that specific weakness alongside addressing the person's own reported difficulties and goals. It's very individualized, very much a team effort.
Right, let's get into the evidence then. That Frontiers review specifically looked at research on what works for adults. What did they find for that first pillar, environmental modifications?
Okay, so environmental mods, this is what they call a bottom-up approach. The idea is to make the sound signal itself better, clearer, before it even gets to the brain.
Like fixing the input.
Kind of, yeah. So this includes things like adapting the physical space. Simple stuff, really. Reducing background noise and echo in rooms, using soft furnishings, carpets, acoustic panels, maybe better windows, thinking about where you sit closer to the speaker, away from the kitchen noise, that kind of thing.
Makes sense.
But a really key tool here is using personal remote microphone systems, often called PRMS or sometimes FM systems.
Okay, how do those work?
So the person talking wears a small microphone, or you place one near the sound source, like a TV. It sends the sound wirelessly directly to a small receiver the listener wears, maybe in their ear, or connected to a hearing aid.
And what does that do?
It does something really powerful. It dramatically improves the signal-to-noise ratio, the SNR.
Signal to noise, basically making the voice louder compared to the background chatter.
Exactly. It cuts through the noise. We're talking potentially boosting that signal by like 20, 25 decibels, which is huge. It gets rid of the problems of distance and echo too. Delivers a really clean sound right to the ear. This can massively reduce the listening effort needed in noisy places.
So what's the verdict from the review? Do they work for APD?
This is where the review found the most consistent evidence of benefit for adults. They did a meta-analysis combining data from multiple studies, and it showed significantly better performance on speech understanding tests when people used PRMS.
That sounds pretty positive.
It is. Other controlled studies back this up too. One study even hinted that using these systems might lead to some longer-term positive changes in the brain's pathways, not just the immediate help.
Were there any caveats? Any downsides?
Well, they do point out that while the evidence is supportive, the overall certainty of that evidence is rated low to moderate. That's pretty common in reviews, looking across diverse studies, different people, different methods, risk of bias in some studies. It makes it hard to be absolutely certain. And they also mentioned that how much someone feels it helps can vary. Depends on your lifestyle, right? If you're in lots of meetings or noisy social events, it might feel like a lifesaver. Less so if you're mostly in quiet environments. And, aesthetics, how it looks, can sometimes be a factor for people.
What about using low-gain hearing aids? Just a little bit of amplification, maybe with noise reduction features.
Yeah, so LGHA, the evidence specifically for APD in adults, according to this review, is pretty thin. Only came from 2 studies they could include.
And what did those studies hint at?
They suggested LGHAs might help improve speech understanding, both on tests and what people reported, particularly for adults whose ATD might be linked to a TBI.
Okay, so maybe in some specific cases.
Perhaps. But the benefits weren't seen for everyone, and kind of tellingly, only about 18–20% of the people who tried them in the studies actually went on to buy them, which suggests maybe the real-world benefit wasn't quite compelling enough for most of that group.
And what did the guidelines say?
It's interesting. Major bodies like the AAA in the U.S. don't currently recommend LGHAs specifically for APD. But guidelines in New Zealand, for example, do suggest they could be considered while still acknowledging the evidence is limited. So the review basically concludes, we need more research here to really know if they're effective for the wider adult APD population.
Okay, so for environmental strategies, PRMS seems like the strongest contender based on this review. Let's move to the second pillar, auditory training, the idea of retraining the brain, right?
Exactly. AP involves doing specific listening exercises designed to stimulate those auditory pathways in the brain. The hope is to kind of harness the brain's ability to change and adapt neuroplasticity to improve how it processes sound. It's also seen as bottom-up, working on those basic processing skills.
Can you do this at home?
You can. It can be formal, in a clinic with a therapist, or informal, often using computer-based programs at home, sometimes called CBAT. But the key principles are that it should be targeted to the specific deficit found in testing, done frequently, and be challenging enough to push the system a bit.
And the evidence. What did the Frontiers review find here?
This was much more mixed. Some studies did show significant improvements on specific auditory test scores after training. People got better at the task they practiced.
Okay, that sounds promising.
But when they looked at the studies with stronger designs, like randomized controlled trials, those studies often found only very small or sometimes no significant improvement in subjective listening ability.
Ah. So maybe better on the tests, but not necessarily feeling easier to listen in daily life.
That seems to be the pattern suggested by the stronger evidence reviewed here. What really matters to people, does it feel easier to follow conversations? Are you less tired from listening? The evidence for that kind of functional improvement from AT in adults wasn't consistently strong in the high-quality studies they analyzed.
Why the mixed results? Is it just hard to study?
Very hard. The review highlights huge heterogeneity. Studies use different types of training. Some focus on timing, some on listening and noise, some on pitch patterns. They train for different lengths of time with different groups of people. It makes comparing results really difficult.
Okay.
And there's another practical issue, adherence. One study specifically mentioned that people often didn't stick with the home-based computer training programs consistently. If you don't do the exercises, you can't expect to benefit.
So for auditory training, the jury is still kind of out on whether it consistently translates to real-world benefit for adults with APD.
Based on this systematic review's look at the high-quality functional outcome studies, yes, that's a fair assessment. They acknowledge neural changes can happen in adults with training, and maybe supervised training is more effective, but strong proof of consistent, widespread functional benefit across the board isn't quite there yet from the rigorous research. Needs more work.
Okay, the third pillar, compensatory strategies. Now, the review didn't find specific studies on these to include, but other sources like ASA and Belisand's alone talk about them a lot. What falls under this category?
These are quite different. They're considered top-down.
Yeah.
They rely on you, the listener, using your brain power, your cognitive skills, your awareness to manage the listening difficulties. It's less about fixing the underlying processing and more about working around it effectively.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. It's things like becoming a really active listener, consciously watching the speaker's face for cues. It's about anticipating tricky situations, like thinking ahead before a noisy meeting. Okay, where should I sit? What can I do? It's learning how to clarify effectively when you miss something, asking specific questions, not just saying what.
Using context clues, too.
Absolutely. Using the topic of conversation to help figure out a word you didn't quite catch, contextual derivation.
Yeah.
And then there are strategies for memory and sequencing issues called meta-memory techniques.
Like what?
Things like mentally repeating information right after you hear it, reauditorization, or chunking long instructions into smaller bits, breaking it down.
And social communication.
Yeah, that's part of it too. Schema induction, understanding typical conversational patterns. And specific social communication training, maybe role-playing difficult scenarios, learning to better interpret tone of voice or body language, managing impulsive responses when you think you misheard something.
So it's about becoming a smarter listener and communicator, but also involves how others communicate with you.
Exactly. That's the other side of compensatory strategies, things you can ask others to do, like asking people to speak a bit slower, check for understanding, maybe rephrase things using simpler words, or even write key information down using visual aids. It's a two-way street.
What about combining interventions? Did the review look at using, say, PRMS and auditory training together?
They only found one study that looked at combining approaches in adults. It was with a specific group, blast-exposed military veterans. They compared standard care plus a PRMS and FM system with standard care, PRMS, and auditory training.
Did adding the training help more?
Interestingly, no. They found no additional benefit from adding the auditory training on top of the FN system and standard care. The researchers suspected this might have been partly due to low adherence again. The participants maybe didn't do the AT part consistently.
So just one study, specific group, hard to draw big conclusions.
Exactly. The review concludes that based on that single study, there's just not enough evidence right now to say whether combining interventions provides extra benefits for the general adult APD population.
Okay, so summing up the evidence from that systematic review, seems like personal remote mics, PRMS, have the most consistent backing for improving listening performance, auditory training. Some promise, but the evidence for real-world functional improvement is still mixed and needs more research. Low-gain hearing aids, still largely experimental for APD. And compensatory strategies are considered crucial, but weren't the focus of the intervention studies in that specific review.
That captures the landscape from the review pretty well. And, the authors themselves really highlighted the challenges in this field. Lots of small studies, huge variation between them in who they studied, what they did, how they measured success. It makes it really hard to compare apples to apples, so to speak.
What needs to happen to get clearer answers in the future?
Several key things came up. One big one is trying to get more agreement internationally on a gold standard for diagnosis and clear criteria that would help make sure studies are looking at more similar groups of people.
Reduce that heterogeneity you mentioned.
Exactly. Also, studies need to do a better job of describing the specific type of auditory processing deficit each participant has, and controlling for other things, like cognitive skills that might influence results.
Better study designs, too.
Definitely. More high-quality designs, like randomized controlled trials, following people for longer to see if benefits actually stick, trying to standardize the auditory training methods, and crucially, the outcome measures used.
And measuring things that matter to people.
Yes. Focusing not just on whether someone improves on a lab test, but on outcomes that are genuinely meaningful in daily life. Social participation, work performance, overall quality of life. Things that matter to you if you're living with this.
So let's bring it back to the listener. If someone's hearing this and thinking, this sounds like me, what's the main takeaway from all this information?
I think it really reinforces a few key things. First, if you struggle to understand speech, especially in noise, even if your hearing test was normal, it could absolutely be APD. It's a real distinct issue related to brain processing.
It's not just not listening properly.
No. Second, getting a proper diagnosis requires specific testing by an audiologist who specializes in this area. It's not something you can self-diagnose or get from a simple screening.
And third,
Intervention isn't one-size-fits-all. The sources, especially Bellies and Anzalone with their case examples, really drive home that the best approach is highly individualized. It depends on your specific pattern of strengths and weaknesses identified through that comprehensive testing.
so the tests tell you what kind of help might work best?
Ideally, yes. They give clues. For example, someone with more difficulty processing timing information might benefit from different strategies or training than someone whose main issue is filtering out background noise, or someone who struggles when information comes to both ears at once. Your plan might involve a mix. Maybe a remote mic for certain situations, specific compensatory strategies you learn to use, and maybe some targeted auditory training exercises. And working with a multidisciplinary team is key. Sometimes the goal is effective management and compensation, not necessarily a complete cure.
Wow. That was a really thorough deep dive into auditory processing disorder in adults. We've gone from the definition through the complexities of diagnosis right into the latest evidence on what helps and where the research needs to go.
It definitely highlights the complexities, and it leaves us with, I think, an important thought. Given that diagnosis can be complex and the research evidence for interventions is still evolving for adults, how can you, as an individual experiencing these difficulties, best work with professionals? How can you make sure you get a really precise understanding of your own unique auditory profile and collaborate on creating an intervention plan that truly targets your needs and makes a real difference in your day-to-day life?
That's a great question to ponder, something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.